Over this past weekend, I went with a group of friends to see Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, and all I can say is I left the theater with some thoughts. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Garmin. This is the Storycraft Society. And like I said, over this past weekend, I went with friends to see the new D&D movie. I've been a DM for like the last 10 years.
You can tell by my old vintage Critical Role t-shirt and limited edition cover of Volo's Guide to Monsters that I am not only a DM, but a DM with taste.
And I don't think that that gives me any credibility about what I'm going to say other than this is all personal opinion. I also am going to mention I'm going to try to do this review with as few spoilers as possible. So be warned, this is not a no spoilers video, although it is my attempt at making a as few as possible spoilers video. So if you care about that sort of thing, don't watch this video until you've seen the movie. Okay, first thing. I think that the number one thing that it did very well is it captured the whimsy and kind of essence of a typical game of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I'm using the term typical because I think that that's really important here, and I think that there's going to be a lot of opinions that I have in this video that are going to be very polarizing, and that's not on purpose, but it is a thing that I hear a lot of people talking about on the internet that tend to be kind of hot topics. Hot takes on D&D, as it were. The example that I'll give when I say a typical game of D&D is I don't think people who are fans of like the intense drama and role play heavy, emotional, like heavy stuff that is watching a game of Critical Role, that's not what you're going to get. I think that it's very similar to the Vox Machina cartoon, which was on Amazon Prime. That felt very similar to the way that this movie comes across, which feels different to me than actually watching Critical Role and the cast play D&D. There's no right or wrong there, but I think the magic that they captured in a bottle with this movie is making a cinematic version of the type of game of D&D that you would find if you went to your friendly local game store and got a pickup game with a bunch of people who just were excited to play Dungeons & Dragons together. It didn't feel like the type of game that I've experienced with my long-term tables of playing for years and years and years and chasing a super narrative-driven story. I didn't get that out of this movie. But the inside jokes and the funny little quips, I think all of those perfectly matched your typical game of D&D. I think that's actually a really good jumping point to the first thing that I think did not work with the movie, and that is going to be the jokes and the quips. I think that so many of the jokes from Honor Among Thieves come from a place of trying to make D&D players laugh at something that they could see happening at their game table of Dungeons & Dragons. Get ready for opinion time. I'm not sure that I think that that is what you want in a Dungeons & Dragons movie. For someone who's never experienced those things at the table, those are going to be jokes that either seem like they are making fun of Dungeons & Dragons, like not in like a, hey, we're all laughing together kind of way, but more like a...
Moving on. Wait, doesn't anyone have a rod of resurrection? Because if you've got one, I need it bad. Get in here with your rod and give it to me.
Okay, you need to say these things in your head before you say them out loud.
Kind of way. It didn't feel like people who actually knew what Dungeons & Dragons was, but more like the idea of people who had an idea in their head of what D&D was. So people who have never played D&D before are either laughing at the game or not understanding the humor. I could be way off, but you know, the idea of making a stupid decision like asking a whole bunch of questions to the body that you just reanimated, and as you ask a question to your party member, the corpse answers the question because they are magically compelled to answer a question, and then it ends up making that the spell fails. That's kind of funny, but that's not the type of thing that I would do to my players as a GM. And also, it seems like the kind of thing that would happen if somebody was trying to come up with quirky things that would happen at a Dungeons & Dragons table. So the way to sum that up is I feel like the humor was so specifically targeted at a very small audience that I don't think that it has wide-reaching potential, which I think was the goal of the movie. My next major issue that I had with the movie was that all of the main characters who were in the D&D party didn't necessarily want to be traveling together. Now, the main pair did, but everyone else kind of was forced into the adventure. They didn't want to be there. And I actually see this as an issue with Dungeons & Dragons as a game as a whole, not just something that happened in the movie. So I guess you could make the argument that the movie itself was mimicking D&D, but not a good part of D&D. And that's the idea that people show up to the table and their characters, for whatever reason, I have seen this in games that I have played in a bunch. The goal of my character is to be quippy and chirpy against your character. We're not friends. We're not here because we want to be and we trust one another. We're here because you showed up at the table to play Dungeons & Dragons and so did I. I just don't feel like in a real world.
Maybe that's the issue. Maybe I'm thinking about this like a real world thing, and maybe it's not actually a real world thing.
But in a real world situation, I just can't see how, if I didn't trust the other people that I was with implicitly, I don't see why I would go into a beholder fight with them or a dragon fight with them. If you don't have my back and I don't have your back, which I think we all can agree, if we have played Dungeons & Dragons, there has been a table that you've sat at where two of the characters do not feel like they have each other's backs. The only reason they're adventuring together is because they are friends outside the game and they're traveling together inside the game for no reason. Does that make sense? I just don't, as a person, as a DM, as a player of Dungeons & Dragons, I just don't like antagonistic behavior between players and DMs. I don't think that leads to the most fun experience, and I certainly don't think that leads to the best story. And I felt like they really leaned into that with the characters in this particular movie. Another major positive of this movie is I just absolutely loved getting to see all of the spell effects and monsters that we know and love from Dungeons & Dragons showing up on the big screen. And it makes all of those cinematic scenes that I have played out in my head with these iconic D&D monsters feel so, I don't know, rewarded to see them up on the screen. And this goes double for getting to see fantasy races represented, because in my head I can just quickly think of Aarakocra, Dragonborn, and Tabaxi that showed up, that you just don't get to see those in cinema or on TV, in movies, that sort of thing, a lot. So that was super awesome to get to see those races represented. The last thing that I want to talk about is an open invitation to everyone to start giving me answers to this in the comments below. I talked to some of my friends who were super into it. I talked to some of my friends that were not into it at all. I fall into the absolutely not into it at all category. But all I'm going to say is Fat Dragon. That's a little bit of a spoiler, but I'm not going to say anything else about it other than I encourage people to talk about it down in the comments. So if you don't want spoilers, definitely don't go rooting around in the comments, because you probably will get it spoiled for you. But why? I've thought about it. I've had a couple of days to think about it. Why? Why? So with all those said, those are my mostly spoiler-free thoughts that came out from watching this movie. I gave it a C+ when I walked out of the theater. It was good. I don't know that I would ever want to see it again, but I enjoyed it while I was getting to see it the first time. And I'm happy that I went to see it in a theater, because I feel like it would have been less impressive to see it on my home TV. But what grade would you give this particular movie? Did you love it? Did you hate it? I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video or these types of videos, definitely let me know as a comment down below. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But I think that's actually it for this week's video. So until next week, I'll be seeing you.